37 years ago, a young sailor vanished into the steel maze of the USS California. When his body was found, questions echoed through every corridor, but the ocean kept its secrets. Now, in a quiet laboratory, a microscopic trace of DNA has broken decades of silence. One fragment, one truth, one family about to discover that justice doesn't always sync with time. Before we get into the story, drop a comment with your country and the time right now. Gray dawn filters through salt-stained portholes as the USS California cuts through Pacific swells. The year is 1984, and steel corridors hum with the rhythm of disciplined routine. 25-year-old Wayne E. Newton moves with quiet precision through the morning watch, his uniform pressed, his manner respectful. In the navigation compartment, Chief Petty Officer Robert "Bob" Miller inspects duty logs with the hard-eyed scrutiny of a man who has commanded at sea for 15 years. "Newton," Miller's voice cuts across the cramped space. "Your report was filed 12 minutes late yesterday." The younger sailor straightens. "Yes, Chief. I was completing the maintenance log for—" "I don't want excuses. I want punctuality." Miller's face reddens slightly, drawing glances from nearby crew members. "You think the Navy runs on good intentions?" Newton's jaw tightens imperceptibly. "No, Chief. It won't happen again." Miller steps closer, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper that somehow carries further than a shout. "See that it doesn't, because next time, you'll find your qualification cards in the trash where they belong." The compartment falls silent except for the distant thrum of turbines. Newton retreats to his assigned station, humiliation burning in his chest as whispers follow him down the corridor. The shipboard rumor mill has already noted Miller's increasing hostility. Fellow sailors exchange meaningful glances. Everyone knows Miller's been riding Newton hard, but no one speaks loud enough for the chief to hear. Hours later, as afternoon drills echo through the ship's labyrinthine passages, Miller approaches Newton again. This time he carries a clipboard and the satisfaction of a man exercising absolute authority. "Schedule change," Miller announces, not bothering to look up from his paperwork. "You're on midnight watch tonight. Report to Section C at 2400 hours. Newton blinks. "Chief, I was scheduled for morning watch. That's 3 shifts in 24 hours. Are you questioning my authority, sailor?" The corridor seems to hold its breath. Newton's bunkmate hovers nearby, pretending to check equipment while listening to every word. Miller's reputation for explosive anger is legendary throughout the ship, and everyone knows that challenging him publicly is career suicide. "No, Chief," Newton replies quietly. "I'll be there." Miller smiles without warmth. "He'll learn discipline," he mutters to himself, but loud enough for others to hear. The altered watch schedule is dutifully logged in the official record, a paper trail of what appears to be routine military procedure but feels like punishment to those who witness it. That evening, Newton confides his frustration to his bunkmate in hushed tones. "I don't know what I did to get on his bad side, but it's getting worse every day. The guy acts like I personally sank his last ship." His bunkmate shakes his head sympathetically. "Keep your head down, man. He'll move on to someone else eventually. They always do." But as night settles over the Pacific and Newton prepares for another grueling shift, neither sailor realizes that time is running out for patience, for endurance, and for the quiet dignity that has defined Wayne Newton's service. At 200 hours, the expected radio call never comes. Newton fails to relieve his post in Section C, and within minutes, internal communications crackle with concern. His replacement waits in the empty compartment, checking his watch and growing increasingly uneasy. Standard protocol demands immediate notification when a sailor misses his assigned duty. "Control, this is Section C. Newton's a no-show for watch relief." The voice over the intercom carries a note of puzzlement rather than alarm. Ships run on precision timing, and Newton has never been late, much less absent without explanation. The duty officer orders a routine check of Newton's quarters, expecting to find him oversleeping or dealing with a minor emergency. But Newton's berth is empty, his bunk made with military precision. Personal items remain undisturbed. His watch, wallet, and letters from home sit exactly where they were placed hours earlier. The orderly appearance rules out desertion or panic. Everything suggests he simply stepped away and planned to return. The search expands methodically through mess halls, recreation areas, and workstations. Crew members join the hunt with growing unease as minutes stretch into an hour. The ship's intercom system carries periodic calls for Newton to report immediately, but only silence responds. Whispers begin to spread through the corridors, quiet speculation about accidents, medical emergencies, or the unthinkable possibility of someone going overboard. The ocean gives up nothing, and the ship's vast interior suddenly feels both too large and too confining. Search teams deploy to lower decks, their flashlights cutting through shadows in rarely visited spaces. The USS California groans and shifts with each swell, her steel bones settling into patterns known only to those who have sailed her for years. Every sound becomes suspect, every shadow a potential clue. "Sir, we need to check the restricted maintenance areas," suggests a petty officer, understanding the grim implications. These spaces, tucked beneath the waterline and accessible only through narrow hatches, represent the ship's most dangerous zones, places where a man could fall, become trapped, or simply disappear. The search expands downward, into the mechanical heart of the cruiser where pipes hiss with steam and the ocean presses against steel hull plates just feet away. Here, in the submarine quiet depths of the ship, the search for Wayne Newton takes on a desperate urgency. Steel ladders clang under the weight of search teams as they descend into the ship's lower sections. Emergency lighting casts harsh shadows across bulkheads, and the air grows thick with the smell of fuel oil and rust. Each footstep echoes through narrow passageways where the ocean's presence feels immediate and threatening. A sailor pauses near a maintenance compartment, his nostrils flaring. "You smell that?" His partner stops, flashlight beam wavering. "Smell what?" "Metallic, like copper." The scent is faint but unmistakable, a smell that raises primitive alarms in men who have seen combat. They follow the odor down a corridor lined with pipes and electrical conduits, their breathing shallow in the confined space. Faint droplets glisten on the deck plating under their flashlight beams. The trail is sparse but consistent, leading toward a rarely accessed maintenance compartment marked with warning signs about unauthorized entry. The heavy hatch stands slightly ajar, its wheel mechanism showing recent disturbance. "Control, this is Search Team 3. The sailor radios, his voice tight with apprehension. "We've got possible evidence in lower section D. Requesting immediate supervisor presence before proceeding." The response crackles back immediately. "Stand fast, senior staff en route." Minutes stretch like hours as they wait outside the hatch, studying the scene without disturbing potential evidence. The metallic odor grows stronger, and both men understand what they are likely to find beyond that threshold. The ship's routine hum continues overhead, but down here in the depths, silence presses against them, like a living thing. When the senior officer arrives with additional personnel, his face is grim with recognition. He has seen enough maritime accidents to know when routine search becomes recovery operation. "Open it slowly," he orders, positioning himself for whatever lies beyond. The hatch wheel turns with a grinding squeal of protest, and the compartment beyond exhales a breath of stale air, tinged with copper and something else, something that makes experienced sailors step back involuntarily. The scene freezes in harsh flashlight beams as Newton's body comes into view, slumped against the far bulkhead of the maintenance compartment. His uniform is torn, and dark stains pattern the deck beneath him. The confined space amplifies every sound: the sharp intake of breath, the muttered prayers, the static of radio communications calling for medical personnel who can no longer help. Blood spatter marks the compartment walls in an upward trajectory, inconsistent with any accidental fall. The wound on Newton's head shows the brutal signature of blunt force trauma, its edges too clean and purposeful to be explained by mishap or machinery malfunction. Even to untrained eyes, the evidence speaks of violence deliberate and personal. The ship's captain arrives within minutes, his face carved from stone as he surveys the scene. This is no longer a missing person case or maritime accident. This is homicide aboard a United States Navy vessel in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. The implications cascade through his mind: crew safety, investigation protocols, chain of custody, notification procedures. "Secure this area, immediately," he orders, his voice carrying the authority of absolute command. "No one enters without my direct authorization, and someone get me the ship's photographer." The announcement comes over the general intercom system 30 minutes later, the captain's words carefully chosen to balance truth with morale. "This is the captain speaking. It is with deep regret that I inform you we have lost a shipmate. Seaman Wayne Newton died in the line of duty. Full honors will be rendered upon our return to port." That is all. But throughout the ship, the whispered truth spreads faster than official statements. Newton didn't die in the line of duty. He was murdered. And somewhere among the crew, walking the same corridors and breathing the same recycled air, is the person responsible. The chapel fills that evening with sailors seeking comfort and answers. The absence of alarm klaxons is replaced by something far more unsettling: the silence of a ship where no one feels entirely safe. Security teams seal off the lower decks while investigators document every detail of the crime scene. The ship's photographer works methodically, his flash illuminating the compartment in stark bursts that burn the tragedy into black and white permanence. Each photograph becomes evidence in a case that already feels impossible to solve. The confined space reveals its secrets grudgingly. Under Newton's fingernails, investigators find a torn fragment of uniform fabric. different from his own, suggesting a struggle. The material is carefully extracted and sealed in evidence bags, though everyone understands the ship lacks sophisticated laboratory facilities for immediate analysis. "Sir, we need to get this to shore-based forensics," the lead investigator reports to the captain. "We can preserve what we have, but proper analysis requires equipment we don't carry." The captain nods grimly. The USS California is still days from the nearest port, and the crime scene grows more contaminated with each passing hour, despite their best efforts. Military justice at sea operates under different rules than civilian law enforcement, but murder demands the highest standards of evidence collection. Throughout the ship, routine continues with mechanical precision, while tension simmers beneath the surface. Crew members eye each other with new suspicion, wondering which of their shipmates might be capable of such violence. The close quarters that once fostered camaraderie now feel claustrophobic and threatening. The sealed compartment becomes a shrine to questions no one can answer. Who wanted Newton dead? Why was he in that restricted area? And most importantly, is the killer still among them, wearing the same uniform and standing the same watches? As the California adjusts course for an emergency rendezvous with shore-based investigators, the ocean keeps its secrets locked in steel and silence. The ship that once felt like home now carries the weight of unfinished justice, sailing toward a port where answers might wait, or where the truth might simply disappear into the bureaucracy of official reports and classified files. One by one, crew members are summoned to a makeshift interview room where investigators attempt to piece together Newton's final hours. The questions follow familiar patterns. When did you last see him? Did he seem troubled? Who else was working in that section? The answers create a mosaic of routine interactions and growing concern. Newton was quiet, respectful, competent. He kept to himself, but got along well with his peers. No one reports seeing him after evening chow, and no one witnessed any confrontation that might explain his death. But 3 separate witnesses mention the same troubling detail: recent tension between Newton and Chief Petty Officer Miller, the verbal conflicts, the public humiliations, the punitive schedule changes, a pattern of harassment that culminated in Newton's final, fatal watch assignment. "Miller's been riding him hard for weeks," one sailor admits reluctantly. "But I don't want to get anyone in trouble." Maybe it was just normal military discipline. Fear of retaliation colors every statement. Speaking against a senior petty officer requires courage that most junior sailors lack, especially when that officer still walks the ship and controls duty assignments. The investigators understand the dynamics, but find themselves trapped by the very hierarchy they represent. The ship's chapel fills each evening with crews seeking solace and guidance. The chaplain offers what comfort he can, but even he seems shaken by the violence that has shattered their closed community. Prayers rise through steel decks, toward stars invisible beyond the ship's hull, carrying questions that only God might answer. As interviews conclude without breakthrough revelations, the official report begins to take shape. Statements are sealed, evidence is catalogued, and the investigation enters bureaucratic limbo. The truth feels close enough to touch but remains just beyond reach, protected by fear and the vast isolation of the Pacific Ocean. Months later, as the USS California completes her deployment and returns to San Diego, the investigation reaches its inevitable conclusion. Shore-based investigators review the accumulated evidence with fresh eyes, but find nothing that wasn't already documented at sea. The case file grows thick with statements, photographs, and carefully preserved physical evidence, but the critical breakthrough never comes. The official report, stamped and filed in Naval Criminal Investigative Service archives, lists Newton's death as homicide, by person or persons unknown. The language is clinical and precise. Victim suffered fatal blunt force trauma to the head. Evidence suggests deliberate assault. Investigation remains open, pending development of additional leads. But everyone involved understands the reality. Without witnesses willing to speak definitively, without forensic evidence sufficient for court proceedings, and without a confession, the case will gradually fade from active investigation to cold storage. Justice delayed becomes justice denied, and Wayne Newton's murder joins thousands of other unsolved cases in military archives. A brief mention appears in Navy Times, buried on page 3. Sailor dies aboard Pacific cruise. Investigation under review. The article provides no details about homicide, no mention of ongoing investigation, no acknowledgement of a family's grief or a crew's trauma. The story disappears as quickly as it appeared, leaving no public record of questions that demand answers. In a climate-controlled warehouse in Maryland, Newton's evidence box is placed on a shelf between other unsolved cases from 1984. The file contains everything investigators thought important: crime scene photographs, witness statements, the fabric fragment found under his fingernails, samples of blood and tissue preserved on slides. The box will remain undisturbed for decades, gathering dust while technology advances and the principals in the case age and retire. Newton's family receives his personal effects and a folded flag, but no explanation for their son's death. The ocean has kept its secret, and time begins its slow work of erosion, wearing away memory and hope in equal measure. In the 2010s, buried in a climate-controlled archive facility in Maryland, an investigator pulls Wayne Newton's file from its resting place among hundreds of other cold cases. The cardboard box shows its age, corners worn, labels faded, but contents preserved with the same meticulous care that characterized the original investigation 30 years earlier. The Naval Criminal Investigative Service has launched an ambitious digitization project, converting decades of paper files into searchable databases. But this case catches the investigators' attention for reasons beyond routine data entry. Clipped to the inside cover is a handwritten index card, yellowed with age. Possible suspect, CPO Robert Miller. Verbal conflicts documented. Insufficient evidence to proceed. The note represents one investigator's final thoughts, preserved like a message in a bottle for whoever might eventually reopen the case. In the margin, someone has scrawled, "Fabric under fingernails. Test when technology improves." That technology has finally arrived. Modern DNA analysis can extract genetic material from microscopic samples, detect evidence that was invisible to 1980s forensic science, and provide statistical certainties that earlier investigators could only dream about. The investigator makes the decision that will change everything. Newton's evidence deserves another chance. The box travels to the Navy's Advanced Forensic Laboratory, where white-coated technicians treat 30-year-old evidence with the reverence due to any active homicide case. The fabric fragment, carefully preserved on slides, yields secrets that time has protected rather than destroyed. Biological material, invisible to the naked eye, still clings to fibers that once meant the difference between justice and abandonment. As the case officially reopens, 3 decades of silence prepare to end. The Navy issues a quiet statement about its historic review initiative, but few people notice the announcement. Most Americans have never heard of Wayne Newton, and those who served with him have scattered to civilian careers and retirement communities across the nation. But in a small town where Newton's parents still live, hope stirs for the first time in decades. In sterile laboratory conditions, technicians work with samples smaller than pinheads, extracting DNA from evidence that has waited 30 years for this moment. The uniform fragment found under Newton's fingernails yields microscopic traces of skin cells, preserved by careful storage and the dry environment of the evidence room. Modern forensic techniques can amplify genetic material from samples that would have been useless to previous generations of investigators. Polymerase chain reaction technology multiplies DNA fragments millions of times, creating enough material for analysis from what appears to be empty space. The process takes weeks, but the results justify the wait. "We've got a partial profile," the lab technician reports, excitement barely contained in her professional voice. "It's degraded, but there's enough for comparison if we can locate a reference sample." The challenge now shifts from science to investigation. Identifying the source of DNA requires a known sample from the suspect, and after 30 years, locating Robert Miller proves surprisingly difficult. Military service records provide last known addresses and social security numbers, but people move, change names, disappear into civilian life. The Navy's Cold Case Unit begins the painstaking process of tracking Miller through decades of paper trails. Veterans Administration records, pension files, Medicare enrollments. Each document brings them closer to a man who may not even realize he's being sought. The investigation that once stalled in the Pacific Ocean now races through databases and bureaucratic networks at the speed of modern technology. But questions remain about the integrity of the evidence. Defense attorneys would challenge any DNA results based on 30-year-old samples, questioning contamination, chain of custody, and laboratory procedures that predate modern standards. The investigators understand that finding Miller is only the beginning. Proving his guilt requires evidence that can survive courtroom scrutiny. Still, for the first time since 1984, the case has direction and momentum. The Navy announces internally that significant progress has been made in the Newton investigation, though details remain classified pending completion of the analysis. Through social media networks and veterans organizations, investigators reconnect with sailors who served aboard the USS California during that fatal deployment. Video calls bridge decades and continents as former crew members, now gray-hailed and settled in civilian careers, struggle to recall details from their Navy years. "I remember Newton," one retired petty officer says, his voice carrying over a scratchy internet connection. "Good sailor. Quiet, kept to himself. But I also remember the tension with Miller. That chief had a temper like a thunderstorm. Calm one minute, explosive the next." Another witness provides the crucial detail that escaped earlier interviews. "I saw Miller near that restricted maintenance area the morning Newton disappeared, maybe 10 minutes before the alarm went off. I was heading to the galley for coffee, and Miller was coming up from below. He looked, I don't know, agitated maybe, sweaty." The memory had been buried for 30 years, considered insignificant at the time but now potentially critical to understanding the timeline of Newton's murder. Fear of retaliation had silenced many crew members during the original investigation, but retirement and civilian life have loosened the bonds of military hierarchy. Defense counsel would later challenge these recovered memories, arguing that 3 decades have corrupted their accuracy beyond reliability. Human memory proves malleable, influenced by suggestion, media coverage, and the natural desire to contribute to justice. But the pattern of testimony creates a compelling narrative about Miller's opportunity and behavior on the morning of the murder. Online veterans forums buzz with speculation about the reopened case. Former California crew members share their own memories and theories, creating a digital reunion centered on tragedy. Some express disbelief that anyone they served with could commit murder. Others admit they always suspected Miller might be capable of violence. The investigation that once suffocated in isolation now benefits from the connected world of the internet, where witnesses can be located, memories can be compared, and evidence can be analyzed with unprecedented precision. Investigators create comprehensive timeline reconstructions, mapping every documented interaction between Newton and Miller during the deployment. Military duty rosters, watch schedules, disciplinary reports, and crew statements combined to reveal a pattern of escalating conflict, culminating in Newton's death. Miller supervised Newton's work assignments with unusual frequency, often reassigning him to undesirable shifts or menial duties that seemed designed to humiliate rather than educate. The disciplinary record shows repeated warnings for minor infractions, suggesting systematic harassment rather than legitimate military correction. Most significantly, on the day of Newton's murder, Miller personally altered the watch schedule to place Newton on midnight duty, a change that put the victim in the exact location where his body was eventually discovered. The paperwork appears routine, but the timing suggests premeditation rather than administrative necessity. An analyst reviewing the data makes the connection that transforms the investigation. Miller didn't just have access to Newton that night. He specifically arranged for Newton to be alone in a restricted area during a time when Miller himself was off duty and unaccounted for. The evidence remains circumstantial, but the pattern is unmistakable. Military investigators begin the process of officially identifying Miller as their primary suspect, a designation that allows them to pursue more aggressive investigative techniques, including formal interrogation and evidence seizure. The breakthrough they need comes from an unexpected source. A former crew member, now a civilian contractor with security clearance, contacts investigators with information he had forgotten for decades. "I found my old diary from that deployment," he explains. "I wrote about hearing arguing coming from the lower decks that night. Loud voices, then silence. I figured it was just normal Navy discipline, but now, the diary entry, dated the night of Newton's murder, provides the closest thing to a witness account that investigators have ever obtained. Timestamps in the margin suggest the argument occurred less than an hour before Newton's body was discovered. The moment that transforms investigation into certainty arrives on a Tuesday morning in the forensic laboratory. The DNA profile extracted from Newton's fingernail evidence matches a reference sample obtained from Miller's military service records. The statistical probability of a false match calculates to less than 1 in 10 million, sufficient for legal proceedings in any courtroom. "We have our answer," the lab director announces to the investigative team. Robert Miller's DNA was under Wayne Newton's fingernails when he died. This wasn't an accident, and it wasn't a random crime. Newton fought his attacker, and that fight preserved the evidence we needed to identify his killer. Within hours, the Navy's internal memo system carries the breakthrough to senior leadership. 30 years of questions collapse into a single, undeniable fact. Chief Petty Officer Robert Miller murdered Seaman Wayne Newton aboard the USS California in 1984. The case that had haunted the naval criminal justice system finally has its answer. News of the DNA match leaks to media outlets within days, despite attempts to maintain operational security. Breakthrough in 1984 military death headlines appear in Navy Times and military blogs, creating the first public awareness that Newton's death was more than a routine accident or suicide. The story captures national attention briefly, representing both the promise of modern forensic science and the persistence of military justice. Cold case advocates praise the Navy's commitment to solving decades-old crimes, while critics question why it took 30 years to apply available technology to preserved evidence. For investigators, who have worked the case across multiple decades, the DNA confirmation brings both satisfaction and soberness. Justice has finally emerged from decades of silence, but the victim remains dead, and the killer has enjoyed 30 years of freedom. The victory feels incomplete, shadowed by all the years when truth lay dormant in an evidence box. The hardest call comes next, notifying Newton's family that their son's murderer has finally been identified. The investigator drives through suburban streets to a modest home, where Newton's elderly parents have waited 30 years for this conversation. Their hair is white now, their movements slower, but their hope has never completely died. The American flag hanging from their front porch honors both their son's service and their own endurance through decades of unanswered questions. We've made significant progress in Wayne's case, the investigator begins carefully, seated in their living room surrounded by Navy photographs and commendation letters. We've identified the person responsible for his death. Newton's mother reaches for her husband's hand, steadying herself for whatever comes next. They have imagined this moment countless times, but never quite believed it would arrive. The briefing packet contains scientific explanations and legal documents, but the essential truth is simple. Their son was murdered by someone who wore the same uniform and swore the same oath. Chief Miller, Newton's father says quietly, the name emerging from somewhere deep in his memory. Wayne wrote about him in his letters. He said Miller was making his life miserable, always finding fault, always pushing. We thought it was just normal military pressure. The letters, preserved in a box in their bedroom closet, reveal Newton's growing frustration with Miller's harassment. CPOM rides me harder than anyone else, one letter reads. I don't know what I did to get on his bad side, but he acts like I personally wrecked his career. The correspondent shows a young man trying to maintain dignity under systematic abuse. The family's emotions cycle through relief, anger, and sadness as they process 3 decades of answered prayers and confirmed fears. Their son didn't die in an accident or take his own life. He was murdered by the very person entrusted to protect and guide him. The betrayal of military brotherhood cuts deeper than civilian crime, violating bonds forged by shared service and sacrifice. As the investigator leaves, Newton's parents vow to attend any legal proceedings that follow. Justice delayed is not justice denied, and they intend to see their son's killer held accountable for his crimes. Retired and living in a modest apartment in Arizona, Robert Miller receives the knock on his door that he may have been expecting for 30 years. 2 naval investigators identify themselves and request his voluntary cooperation in an ongoing investigation. Their tone professional, but unmistakably serious. Miller, now 73 and frail, listens as they outline the DNA evidence linking him to Newton's murder. His hands shake slightly as he reviews crime scene photographs that he hasn't seen since 1984, and his breathing becomes shallow when confronted with the scientific certainty of his identification. I don't remember much about that deployment, he claims, his voice hoarse with age and anxiety. A lot of sailors served under me over the years. Can't say I recall this particular incident, but when shown photographs of the restricted maintenance compartment where Newton died, Miller's composure cracks visibly. His eyes dart away from the images, and he stumbles over explanations for why his DNA would be found under the victim's fingernails. The investigators watch quietly as the weight of evidence crushes the defenses Miller has constructed over 3 decades. Defense counsel arrives within an hour, advising Miller to exercise his right to remain silent. The legal machinery of military justice begins grinding into motion as prosecutors evaluate the strength of their case and defense attorneys challenge the admissibility of 30-year-old DNA evidence. Media outlets pick up the story as news of Miller's questioning becomes public. Cold case revived after decades, headlines bring national attention to a crime that few people remember. Veterans organizations debate the implications of prosecuting elderly former service members for decades, old crimes, while victim advocacy groups praise the persistence of military justice. Miller leaves the interview room trembling, his lawyer guiding him through a crowd of reporters who shout questions about murder and DNA and justice delayed. For 30 years, he has lived with the secret of what happened in that dark compartment aboard the USS California. Now the secret has followed him home. Military prosecutors compile their case file with the methodical precision that defines military justice. The evidence spans 3 decades. Crime scene photographs from 1984, witness statements collected across multiple investigations, disciplinary records showing Miller's pattern of harassment, and a DNA analysis that finally broke the case open. The challenge lies not in proving Miller's guilt, but in ensuring the evidence can survive courtroom scrutiny. Defense attorneys will challenge every aspect of the investigation: contamination during evidence storage, reliability of degraded DNA samples, accuracy of witness memories after 30 years, and the chain of custody for evidence that predates modern forensic standards. We have sufficient grounds for formal proceedings, the prosecutor concludes after reviewing the complete file. The DNA evidence alone provides statistical certainty, and the circumstantial evidence creates a compelling narrative of motive, opportunity, and timeline. Miller had the means to commit this crime, the authority to place Newton in that location, and the DNA proof that he was present during the murder. The internal recommendation moves through military legal channels with unprecedented media attention. Veterans organizations divide between supporting justice for Newton and questioning the prosecution of elderly former service members. Online forums debate the fairness of applying modern forensic standards to decades-old cases. The case represents more than individual justice. It tests the military's commitment to accountability across time and rank. If senior personnel can escape responsibility for abusing their authority, the foundation of military discipline erodes. But prosecuting frail retirees for ancient crimes raises questions about the statute of limitations on institutional memory. As the file moves toward formal legal proceedings, Newton's family prepares for a trial they never thought they would see. 30 years of grief and uncertainty focus on a courtroom where science will confront denial, where memory will challenge time, and where justice will finally attempt to balance scales that have been weighted by silence for 3 decades. In a modest naval courtroom decorated with flags and maritime tradition, the hearing convenes to determine Robert Miller's responsibility for Wayne Newton's death. The proceedings carry the weight of both legal precedent and institutional honor, as the military justice system confronts one of its oldest unsolved homicides. The judge, a career naval officer with silver hair and measured demeanor, calls the hearing to order. His voice carries the authority of decades at sea and the solemn understanding that this case will be remembered long after the participants have retired. The courtroom fills with Newton's family, former crew members, and media representatives, documenting a story 30 years in the making. This hearing will examine evidence related to the death of Seaman Wayne Newton aboard the USS California in 1984, the judge announces. We convene not to prosecute the deceased, but to determine truth and provide closure to those who have waited 3 decades for answers. The prosecutor rises to deliver opening statements that summarize the evolution of the case from cold storage to scientific breakthrough. Ladies and gentlemen, this is a case about abuse of authority, systematic harassment, and ultimately murder. The evidence will show that Chief Petty Officer Miller used his position to torment a subordinate sailor, arranged for that sailor to be alone in a restricted area, and killed him in a moment of rage that has haunted the Navy for 30 years. Defense counsel counters with challenges to evidence integrity and witness reliability. My client is a 73-year-old man, being asked to defend against charges based on degraded DNA and faded memories. The prosecution asks you to believe that evidence stored in boxes for 30 years retains the same integrity as fresh crime scene materials. They ask you to trust the memories of elderly witnesses recalling events from their youth. Murmurs ripple through the gallery as family members and former crew members absorb the opening arguments. The case that began in silence will finally be heard in the bright light of legal proceedings, where truth and doubt will compete for the same verdict. The forensic expert takes the witness stand with the calm confidence of someone who has spent decades translating scientific evidence into legal language. Her testimony represents the heart of the prosecution's case, the DNA analysis that finally broke 30 years of silence. Modern technology allows us to extract genetic material from microscopic samples that would have been useless to investigators in 1984, she explains, using charts and photographs to illustrate the process. The fabric fragment preserved under Seaman Newton's fingernails contained skin cells that remained viable for analysis despite their age. The prosecutor guides her through the technical details: DNA extraction procedures, statistical analysis of genetic markers, and the protocols used to prevent contamination during testing. The numbers are overwhelming in their certainty. The probability of the DNA belonging to anyone other than Robert Miller calculates to less than 1 in 10 billion. A second laboratory conducted independent analysis of the same samples. The expert continues. Their results confirmed our findings with identical statistical certainty. The DNA under Wayne Newton's fingernails came from Robert Miller. There is no scientific doubt about this conclusion. Defense counsel challenges the reliability of 30-year-old evidence during cross-examination, questioning storage conditions, handling procedures, and the possibility of contamination during the original investigation. Isn't it true that DNA can degrade over time, producing false results that appear scientifically valid? DNA is remarkably stable under proper storage conditions. the expert responds. The samples were preserved in a climate-controlled environment and handled according to established chain of custody procedures. Multiple safeguards prevent the type of contamination or degradation that might produce false positives. The testimony carries additional weight because of its independence from the original investigation. Modern forensic scientists have no stake in the 1984 case outcome. Their only commitment is to scientific accuracy and legal truth. When news broadcasts air segments titled "Science Ends 37-Year Mystery," public opinion shifts toward accepting the DNA evidence as conclusive proof of Miller's guilt. The judge overrules defense motions to dismiss the DNA evidence, ruling that proper storage and independent confirmation overcome concerns about sample age and integrity. Former crew members testify via video link from across the country, their faces lined with age, but their memories sharp when focused on the events of 1984. Each witness adds another piece to the mosaic of evidence surrounding Newton's death, creating a timeline that places Miller at the scene with motive and opportunity. A retired petty officer, now a grandfather living in Ohio, provides the most damaging testimony. "I was heading to the galley around 1:30 hours when I saw Chief Miller coming up from the lower decks. He looked agitated, sweating despite the cool air. When I said good morning, he just grunted and walked past without acknowledging me. That was unusual. Miller was always big on military courtesy." The timeline places Miller near the crime scene less than 30 minutes before Newton's body was discovered. Combined with the DNA evidence, the testimony creates a compelling narrative of opportunity and presence that the defense struggles to counter. Cross-examination focuses on the reliability of memories that are decades old, challenging witnesses to recall specific details about lighting, timing, and Miller's behavior. Defense counsel probes for inconsistencies and contradictions, but the witnesses remain steady in their core recollections. 30 years is a long time. The defense attorney presses one witness. "How can you be certain about the time, the location, or even the person you saw?" "Some things you don't forget," the witness replies simply. "When your shipmate turns up dead, you remember every detail about that night. I've carried those memories for 30 years, wondering if what I saw meant something. Now I know it did." Another former sailor testifies about Miller's pattern of harassment toward Newton. The public humiliations, the punitive duty assignments, the threats about qualification cards. The testimony reveals a systematic campaign of abuse that culminated in the fatal midnight watch assignment. "Miller had it out for Newton," the witness states with conviction. "Everyone on the ship knew it. The chief would find fault with everything Newton did, even when his work was perfect. It wasn't normal military discipline, it was personal." The video testimony carries emotional weight that transcends legal technicalities. These men served together, lived in close quarters, and shared the brotherhood of naval service. Their willingness to speak against a former superior officer reflects both loyalty to Newton's memory and the courage that comes with advancing age. Empathy surges through online veterans communities, as retired sailors recognize the dynamics of shipboard life and the courage required to challenge authority. The testimony transforms abstract DNA evidence into human drama, showing how institutional power can corrupt and how silence can enable tragedy. As each witness concludes his testimony, the courtroom gains a deeper understanding of the toxic environment that led to Newton's murder. The defense counsel granted an emotional recess, understanding that the cumulative weight of testimony is overwhelming their client's position. Defense counsel presents their challenge to the prosecution's case with professional competence but limited ammunition. Their strategy focuses on reasonable doubt rather than alternate theories, questioning the reliability of evidence and the sufficiency of proof rather than proposing different explanations for Newton's death. Ladies and gentlemen, this case asks you to convict a man based on evidence that is 30 years old, the defense attorney argues. A DNA that has been stored in boxes, handled by multiple people, and processed using techniques that didn't exist when these samples were collected. You're being asked to trust science that couldn't be verified at the time of the alleged crime. The argument carries legal weight in an era when wrongful convictions based on faulty forensic evidence have shaken public confidence in scientific testimony. DNA analysis, while generally reliable, has produced false results when samples are contaminated, mislabeled, or processed incorrectly. But the defense faces a fundamental problem. They cannot explain how Miller's DNA came to be under Newton's fingernails without acknowledging physical contact between the two men. Any innocent explanation requires scenarios that seem implausible given the timeline and circumstances. The defense presents character witnesses who testify to Miller's decades of military service without incident, his post-retirement community involvement, and his reputation among those who served with him. The testimony attempts to create reasonable doubt by showing a different side of the accused, a career sailor who dedicated his life to service and country. Bob Miller served his nation with honor for 25 years. One witness states, "He was tough but fair, demanding but supportive. The idea that he could commit murder goes against everything I knew about his character." However, personnel files introduced as evidence reveal a different pattern. Multiple complaints about Miller's treatment of subordinates, disciplinary actions for inappropriate leadership methods, and witness statements describing his explosive temper and abuse of authority. The most damaging revelation comes from Newton's service record, where previous complaints about Miller's harassment were documented but not acted upon. The military hierarchy that should have protected Newton instead enabled his tormentor, creating the conditions that led to his death. The judge delivers his findings with the gravity befitting a case that has spanned 3 decades and touched countless lives. His measured cadence fills the silent courtroom as lawyers, family members, and former crew members lean forward to hear words that will finally close the book on Wayne Newton's murder. After careful consideration of all evidence presented, this court finds sufficient proof to attribute responsibility for Seaman Wayne Newton's death to Chief Petty Officer Robert Miller. The judge announces, "The DNA evidence provides scientific certainty of physical contact during the time of death. Witness testimony establishes motive, opportunity, and presence at the crime scene. The totality of evidence supports the conclusion that Miller caused Newton's death through deliberate violence." Newton's mother closes her eyes and weeps quietly, her husband's arm around her shoulders, as 30 years of questions finally receive their answer. The tears are not celebration but release, the end of wondering, the beginning of healing, and the validation that their son's life mattered enough for justice to pursue his killer across decades. The judge continues with formal findings. The Navy's investigation into this matter has been thorough and professional. While criminal prosecution is no longer possible due to the passage of time and the defendant's age, this court officially determines that Robert Miller bears responsibility for Wayne Newton's homicide aboard the USS California in 1984. Miller, seated at the defense table with his attorney, shows no visible reaction to the verdict. His hands remain folded, his eyes fixed on the table before him. Whatever emotions he carries, guilt, relief, defiance, or resignation, remain locked behind the same silence that has protected him for 30 years. The Navy issues orders for Newton's service record to be amended, removing any implications of suicide or accident, and officially recognizing his death as homicide. A posthumous commendation acknowledges both his service and the injustice of his death, restoring honor to a name that was never diminished but needed institutional recognition. As the hearing concludes, family members and former crew members embrace in the hallway outside the courtroom. Justice has finally been served, delayed but not denied. 6 months after the hearing, a memorial service convenes aboard the USS California's successor ship, where active duty sailors join veterans and family members to honor Wayne Newton's memory. The ceremony takes place at sunset, the ocean reflecting golden light as a Navy chaplain speaks words of remembrance and redemption. "We gather not to celebrate the solving of a crime, but to honor a sailor whose life was cut short and whose memory has endured," the chaplain intones. Wayne Newton served his country with distinction, and his sacrifice, though not chosen, reminds us of the bonds that unite all who wear the uniform. Newton's parents, now in their 80s, stand beneath the flag that once flew over the ship where their son died. The folded flag they received decades earlier is joined by a new one, lowered to half-staff in his honor, and presented with full military ceremony. Their tears reflect both grief and gratitude, as the Navy finally acknowledges the truth of their son's death. Former crew members, gray-hyaled and wearing civilian clothes that cannot entirely disguise their military bearing, stand in formation as taps echoes across the water. They remember a quiet young man who deserved better, protection from the very institution that demanded his loyalty and sacrifice. An engraved plaque is unveiled on the ship's memorial wall. Seaman Wayne E. Newton, 1959-1984. Justice afloat. The simple words capture both the long journey toward truth and the Navy's commitment to honoring those who serve, even when that service ends in tragedy. The ceremony concludes with the traditional bell ceremony, where Newton's name is read aloud and honored with the ringing of the ship's bell. The sound carries across calm seas, toward a horizon where the Pacific meets the sky, a fitting farewell for a sailor whose truth finally surfaced from the depths of time. As the sun sets and families prepare to return to shore, the ocean maintains its eternal rhythm, no longer keeper of secrets, but witness to justice. Finally rendered, the waves that once concealed Wayne Newton's truth now carry his memory toward shores where his story will be remembered and his sacrifice honored. The headlines fade quickly from public attention, replaced by newer crimes and fresher tragedies, but the impact of Newton's case resonates through the military justice system for years to come. Justice, after 37 years, represents more than individual closure. It demonstrates the persistence of institutional memory and the power of modern science to resurrect truth from the grave of bureaucratic silence. Cold case units across all branches of the military experience renewed funding and support, as leadership recognizes the importance of never abandoning unsolved crimes. Newton's case becomes a template for applying modern forensic techniques to decades-old evidence, proving that time does not automatically erase the possibility of justice. Defense attorneys specializing in military law study the case as precedent for DNA evidence in aged cases, while prosecutors use it to argue for expanded resources to investigate historical crimes. The balance between scientific certainty and procedural fairness continues to evolve as technology advances beyond the capabilities that solved Newton's murder. In the modest home where Newton's parents still live, the phone calls from reporters have stopped, and the legal documents have been filed away. The plaque from the memorial ceremony sits on their mantelpiece, beside photos of their son in uniform, finally accompanied by official recognition of how he died and who killed him. Robert Miller lives in relative obscurity, his name permanently associated with the murder he committed 30 years earlier. The legal proceedings have ended, but the moral weight of his actions follows him through retirement communities and veterans gatherings where his former shipmates know the truth about Wayne Newton's death. The USS California continues her patrol missions, with new crews who learn Newton's story as part of their shipboard traditions. His name appears on memorial plaques and in historical records that ensure future sailors understand both the honor of naval service and the responsibility that comes with authority over others. The ocean horizon glows red with another Pacific sunset, eternal and peaceful, no longer concealing secrets, but reflecting the light of truth finally revealed. Justice delayed but never abandoned, memory preserved across decades, and one family's long vigil finally ended in the restoration of their son's honor.